Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first fully streamed class. All of you are at home today, streaming with us rather than having some in the classroom. And we're thankful to be able to continue with the class despite the circumstances. And because you're not here this morning in the classroom, I get to have my mask off. So I appreciate that, and I hope you appreciate being able to see my face. I see some people joining the class now. One thing that I want to try today is that you can use the YouTube chat to ask questions. And you should go ahead and enter your question in the chat as soon as you have a question. And then when I get to a good transition point, I will try to field some questions. But there's going to be a little bit of a delay, so I can't respond immediately. I'm going to wait until I have some questions and I have a good opportunity in the lecture to do so. So let's just go over the expectations now going forward for the next week. We're not going to have in-person classes, and we'll wait for an update to see if we're able to come back into the classroom. That means that you should be streaming, if at all possible, live with us so you can interact. If you're prevented from doing that, you could watch it archived, but I prefer that you stream with us so we're all participating together as much as possible. If you have any questions about the change in our format, in addition to any content questions that you're not able to ask during class, please email me and I'll try to be as responsive as I can be to your questions. Let's begin with prayer. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who hast caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant that we may in such wise hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that by patience and comfort of thy holy word, we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which thou hast given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who liveth and reigneth with thee and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. You'll remember that in the last class, we were wrapping up the book of Judges, so I'd like to say a few things to wrap up the book of Judges before we move on to the book of Ruth. And when we come to Ruth, I want to talk some more about the paper you have coming up. Let's begin by wrapping up on the book of Judges. We were coming to the conclusion of the Samson narratives last time, and I was showing you how, in fact, Samson is portrayed as a failed Nazirite. We saw that in the Nazirite vow, the Nazirite was not to touch corpses, not to drink any wine or alcoholic beverages, and not to cut his or her hair. And we also saw that unlike the Nazirite vow, which is for a limited period of time, Samson was to be a lifetime Nazirite. And the benefit of being a lifetime Nazirite dedicated to God was that God gave him superhuman strength. But that strength was dependent not just on his hair, but on this Nazirite vow being dedicated to God. And the story then sequentially shows us how he violates these vows, how he touches corpses, how he is involved in throwing a drinking party, and how eventually his hair is cut by Delilah. And it's through his love of women and desire for these women that he's ultimately defeated by the cutting of his hair and the capture by the Philistines. However, in captivity to the Philistines, his hair begins to grow. And he prays to God, the first time he prays to God in the narrative, and asks for God's strength. And in that moment, he's able to bring down the Philistine temple and to kill the Philistines. So this Nazirite vow then is a means of structuring the whole narrative of Samson and characterizing him. First as an apostate, as a failed Nazirite, and then second as in some way renewing his dedication to the Lord, and maybe even drawing closer to God than he has been throughout his life up to that point. But of course, he gives his life to defeat the Philistines. And we'll go to the next slide here. See if I can get this up on the screen. Couple of key moments in the Samson narrative. We have at the beginning the recognition by the angel to Samson's mother, already before his birth, that he will begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And that raises the question, well, who will complete it? It won't be completed in the book of Judges. That's going to remain into the early monarchy period, this threat from the Philistines. So there's an anticipation here already in the book of Judges. But he will judge or deliver Israel by defeating the Philistines. That's his primary contribution as a judge, as many of the judges do. Then there's the theme of eyes that I wanted to point out. In fact, Micah and I were talking about this last time. That Samson says to his father, "Get her for me," that is the Philistine woman from Timnah, "because she's right in my eyes." And remember, last time we were talking about this theme of the eyes in terms of whose judgment, whose evaluation is it involved? Is it God's judgment, what is right in God's eyes, or what is evil in God's eyes, or is it the human judgment and perspective? Samson here, picking up on that language, is saying, she's right in my eyes. I desire her, even though she was a foreign woman and the Israelites weren't supposed to intermarry. His father and mother did not know this was from the Lord, for he was seeking a pretext to act against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. There's a mystery here in terms of the interaction of the human will and the divine will, which we've been exploring in various places as we move through the Old Testament narrative, that the human desire and actually action could be evil, could be wrong. And yet God mysteriously can work through human sin to carry out his purposes. Doesn't mean that God is the source of the sin or that the human is justified. Those two things mysteriously in the biblical worldview can overlap with each other. And this is another one of those examples that it wasn't a good thing for Samson to desire Philistine women. And we have a subtle characterization of that here in it's right in his eyes, rather than in God's eyes, it being wrong. It's right in his eyes. And yet the Lord is somehow involved in this and somehow using this to defeat the Philistines, because his desire for Philistine women will lead to his conflict with the Philistines, and his great might will allow him to battle them and to defeat them. So we hear picked up here already in the Samson story this reference that we're going to get repeated at the end of the book. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, which is a shift from doing evil in God's eyes earlier in the book to now the human perspective and the human evaluation. Each one does what's right in his own eyes. Samson is portrayed here as an example of this. And we saw that there is this declining movement in the book of Judges in terms of the judges over time. They're getting worse. And things are getting worse for Israel. And this theme seems to be continued here because remember what the Philistines did to him when they captured him. That is, they gouged out his eyes. So the one who sought what was right in his own eyes has his eyes gouged out as a result. And they brought him to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. So this is another element in the subtle characterization of Samson as a negative figure, as one who embodies the desire for what's right in his own eyes, and that desire and that path will ultimately lead to blindness for Israel, as well as literally for Samson. The narrator's final comment is, those he killed at his death were more than he killed during his life. At that moment where he called out to God and was able to bring down the Philistine temple. Let's move on now to the conclusion of the book. And we talked last time about some of the difficult chronology of the book of Judges that could be the result of these judges actually, because they're locally operative in their different tribes and different areas, they could be overlapping with each other. They're not necessarily sequential, which makes it difficult in dating. And also, this final section of the book probably comes from earlier in this time period. It's not that it's the latest moment in the time period of the Judges, but it's been placed here intentionally to end with this most bleak picture. And also we have to say that just like some movies are rated R, this scripture has been rated R. Restricted. Under 17 requires accompanying parent or adult guardian. I think everybody in our class is over 17. In fact, I know that. So you're able to get admittance to this part of Scripture, but it's very graphic, as you know, as you've been reading. And we're going to see some gruesome things here in this part of the book of Judges. Chapters 17 through 21, the conclusion to the book. Here's a basic outline of this section. And here we see that, in fact, these narratives seem to be organized around key characters being Levites. There's, first of all, the Levite and false worship in chapters 17 through 18, which has sections about the temple of Ephraim and the temple of Dan. So these two temples. And then we have the stories of the Levite and the tribal war in chapters 19 through 21, which has the subsections, the story of the Levite's concubine, the war against Benjamin, and then the war against Jabesh Gilead. So what we're going to see here in these two sections is first the corruption of worship in Israel, and then we see Israel descending into tribal warfare. So instead of only struggling against these foreign powers, now they're struggling and fighting and killing each other in the final section of the book. And so for the author of the book of Judges, this is the lowest point, the most bleak picture, where the Israelites are killing each other. So in this first section, the Levite and false worship, we have what I call the do-it-yourself temple. And we have a character named Micah who steals his own mother's silver and is cursed for it. Then his mother pledges 1,100 silver, but gives him only 200. And this silver, in the dishonest dealings between mother and son, then is cast as an image of the Lord. So it's of the God of Israel, but of course we know in the second commandment that there's a prohibition on images, in addition to a prohibition on worshiping other gods. So this is rank idolatry here that's happening. And then Micah makes an ephod apparently for the practice of divination, and teraphim, or family gods, for his home shrine. And then he makes his son a priest in his do-it-yourself temple. And finally employs a Levite. Then this Levite is taken by the marauding tribe of Dan. And they take the Levite and all of these images and establish their own temple in the north of the land. So we have a very dubious origin story for the shrine in Dan. Now, let me go back one slide and show you here. These temples here will eventually be the sites of worship in the northern kingdom. After the monarchy is divided, they'll set up a northern and a southern shrine site for the idolatrous worship of the God of Israel. And these are actually the sites that we're talking about here. So this is giving us a very suspect and corrupt history of worship in these sites. So the corruption of worship. Here we go. I'll illustrate it here on the map. It's King Jeroboam who later set up golden calves at Bethel and Dan, and Bethel being in Ephraim. They became the two primary shrines for the northern kingdom of Israel, which were idolatrous. So this story is not only talking about how bad the Judges period is, but it's talking about how bad it will be in the future when this tradition of worship in these sites and idolatrous worship at that continues in the northern kingdom. Next, if we look at the story of the concubine of the Levite. In Judges 19, we're going to encounter a story that is designed to parallel the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is the worst people, the most wicked and evil people of the land, who were notorious and who were destroyed by God's judgment during the time of Abraham. But this story is set up to mirror or follow analogously this earlier narrative. So we have, if you recall, in Genesis 18 and 19, Abraham, portrayed as a father, he provides amazing, generous hospitality to three people. And these three people, or men as they're called, turn out to be angels that he's providing hospitality for. And then the angels leave from Abraham's place. Actually, two of them do. One stays, who is the angel of the Lord speaking for God, and the other two go to Sodom, where they meet the foreigner, Lot, in the square, and he provides hospitality for them. So another story of hospitality. Like Abraham, no one else there would provide the hospitality, would host them, but he would. And you remember back with Abraham and God's dialogue, Abraham is asking that God would spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah if there are righteous people there. And they're kind of bargaining back and forth, and Abraham's trying to lower the number. And he gets it quite low. And so the point is, God is generous and willing to spare, but even the number that Abraham works down to is still, the number of righteous is still under that. And so in God's mercy, he's actually going to deliver Lot and his family out of the destruction that's coming on Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is why the angels have come there. But after he welcomes the angels into his home, brutally, the men of the city gang up and they want to gang rape these men. As far as they know, they're men. We know they're angels. At night. But the host, who is Lot, offers two women, his daughters, to save his guests, the people who are under his roof and under his hospitality. He tries to save them by offering his own children, his own daughters, in their place. And you remember the story that they actually strike the men with blindness, and then they deliver Lot and his daughters. The rest of his family doesn't come, including his wife. They deliver Lot and his daughters, and Sodom is destroyed by fire and brimstone. So that's the earlier story in the book of Genesis. And then here in Judges 19, it just happens to be also chapter 19, as in Genesis 19, that a father offers hospitality to his daughter is the concubine of the Levite. And she leaves and runs away from the Levite to her father's house. And when the Levite comes to find her with his servant, the father gives hospitality. And it ends up being three people, to the Levite, the servant, and the concubine. So you see this parallel between the father's hospitality to three people. And this is a Levite from Bethlehem of Judah. But he has traveled to Gibeah of Benjamin. And the men of the city meet this foreigner. Well, he's met in the square and provided hospitality, but by hosts. But the men of the city try to do the same thing. They attempt to gang rape the man at night, and the host offers two women again. So in this same way, the guest saves the host, and Gibeah is destroyed. So this time they take the offer, and the concubine is brutally raped and murdered. So it's, in that sense, it's even worse than the Sodom story. So what is this pattern doing? It's by establishing a narrative analogy between these stories. What's the purpose of it? A major purpose seems to be to portray Israelites as bad as Sodomites. They have become like the most wicked people of the land of Canaan. Here at the end of the book of Judges. That's a major purpose of the author, to demonstrate this through these narrative analogies. So here are some of the key sites that we're dealing with here. Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. And why, we might ask, are these the people and places that are being emphasized here of all the tribes and all the places in the land? It seems to be an anticipation, again, of a future history. Are Judah and Benjamin important in the future history? Who comes from Judah? David comes from the tribe of Judah. The kingship comes from the tribe of Judah. But there was a king before David who came from what tribe? Saul came from the tribe of Benjamin. And then Ephraim becomes, in a way of referring to the northern kingdom. So we're having played out here interactions and themes that are foreshadowing or anticipating what's going to happen in the later history of Israel, that we will have kings coming from Judah and Benjamin, and a division between the northern and the southern kingdoms. Already it's playing out here in the book of Judges. And finally we come to a tribal war, which results from the rape and murder of the concubine. It escalates from this very specific and personal story to the tribes. And this sexual violence and physical violence of murder get amplified in the deaths of the ensuing tribal battle. We have 40,000 Israelites, 25,000 Benjaminites from the tribe of Benjamin, and we have people getting annihilated in Gibeah, Jabesh Gilead. And the brutal sexual assault of the woman gets played out then in the 400 virgins being captured from Jabesh Gilead and 200 girls abducted from Shiloh as well. So just like in the overarching structure of the book, where things progress and get worse, or the snowball grows over time, we have here that same pattern at the end of the book, where these personal sins are amplified and spread out and are infecting and corrupting and destroying Israel. So we have a few different themes that we've seen in the book of Judges. We're going to need to move on, but we can wrap up here by looking at some of the themes from the repeated language in the book. First is the sin of Israel, and we have repeated, Israel did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, which eventually becomes, by the end, a relativistic evaluation by each individual. Each man did what was right in his own eyes. The growing sin of Israel. We also have the theme of God's work in history. God raises up the deliverers, these judges, to deliver Israel from their foreign oppressors. and the Spirit of the Lord is empowering them for battle. Why? Not just because God is promoting violence, but because God has a covenant with Israel. And God is being faithful to his covenant despite the unfaithfulness of the Israelites. And a major component of that is to ensure their survival by defeating their enemies. And so it's not a moral affirmation of the judges or the people involved in the battles. As we saw before, when we think about the judges, we shouldn't be thinking about moral examples. But again, God working through this very messy human history to ensure the survival of his people. And finally, the need for a king. We have repeated in the final section of the book, in those days there was no king in Israel. So that's a negative judgment from the perspective of monarchy. So it shows that the author of the book, or at least the author of this section, is writing after the monarchy and is looking back and evaluating this time period and saying the problem is they don't have a king. There is chaos and disunity, and having a king would bring unity and would bring peace to the people. So the author is not only giving a negative characterization of this period, but giving a positive characterization of the institution of the monarchy, and especially of the Davidic monarchy and the Davidic king, because you notice that Judah is consistently portrayed positively in the book, and Benjamin is portrayed negatively, as we've seen in several different examples. So we'll need to move on from the book of Judges now into a discussion of the book of Ruth. And I'm not seeing questions. I see some comments, but I don't see questions in the chat. So I'm not going to, won't take time for that now until I see some questions there. Let me switch over my slides to Ruth. Okay, there we go. So we want to cover the book of Ruth as we cover these books of the Old Testament, but I also want to do something additional with our discussion of Ruth, because you remember, I hope you remember, and I hope you're working on it, your historical book paper. And I want to take a pause here and to review what you're doing on that, and you should be working on it. And then what I want to do with the book of Ruth, we could discuss a lot of different topics, but what I want to do is show you how I would do this paper using the book of Ruth, to show you a model that you can emulate, that you can follow as you write your historical book paper and do that assignment. So let's see the description of the historical book paper. So you remember you're supposed to pick one of the three historical books, Kings, Chronicles, or Ezra, Nehemiah, which we normally think of as 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and two separate books, Ezra and Nehemiah, and read them together as a single literary whole. And then, as you read them together carefully, taking notes, you want to try to form a thesis that is trying to put into words the main message of this book. If it really is a single literary work, which it is, I believe, and though we don't often think of them this way, then we could say some things about what is the message of the book as a whole. And it is one of these practices that we're trying to foster in this class of looking at the larger literary context and seeing how that larger context gives meaning to all those verses and smaller pericopes that we encounter in the book. So you're going to ask yourself, what would be the central message of this book taken as a whole? And that becomes your thesis for your paper. And then the next step is to marshal the evidence for your point. So you should think of me as a skeptic. Even though I'm very sympathetic to this project because I'm giving it to you and I think that it's fruitful, but think of me in reading these papers as a skeptic. And I'm saying to you, well, why? Show me how this is the case, that there's a message to this book as a whole, and that it's not just a bunch of different sources that don't cohere with each other, or a bunch of different verses that each have their own meaning apart from the whole. And so you're going to marshal the evidence. You're going to show me in the paper the evidence. You can appeal to things like the historical background, but especially the literary structure and the themes of the book. And you should consult 5 sources, one of which can be your textbook. But this really isn't a research paper. It's an exercise in reading larger biblical contexts. And so I want you to put the emphasis on your reading of this larger whole. And then, after you've taken notes and you've read, to lean back in your chair and put your feet up on the desk and to meditate, to think about this book, and to try to think about what are the main themes, what are the things that keep coming up, what are the major episodes at major points in the story. How does it begin? How does it end? Asking yourselves these questions and trying to say, what is this all about? What is it conveying to me as a reader? So we've gone over that before, but that's the task in the historical book paper for you. And those papers are going to be due on the 16th. So if you haven't already started, please start right away. And if you have, keep up the work. And hopefully then after we turn these papers in, we're going to have some experts on these different books in class for discussion. And hopefully we'll have an avenue, a means to have that kind of a discussion, whether in the classroom or online. What I want to do now, as I said, is to use the book of Ruth as an example. So in our time remaining, I will structure my lecture as if it's one of these historical book papers. And I'm taking a much smaller unit, the book of Ruth, and I'm trying to ask the same questions on a smaller scale that you're going to be asking on a much larger scale. So the book of Ruth. So here's a possible synthesis or thesis for the book of Ruth. All right? Would be the thesis statement of a paper that's trying to sum it up, like this historical book paper. Through the unlikely faithfulness of a Moabite widow, God blesses the destitute Naomi with food, land, and family. So that's the main point. I tried to state it succinctly. It's fairly packed, but I tried to state it succinctly. And then I thought there was a secondary or an additional theme that was also important, but that there was the primary message and a secondary message that builds upon the first. So that's why I put it into 2 sentences like this. Now, the second one is the second sentence. Ultimately, God even blesses Israel with King David. So that the story is, first of all, about these characters, Naomi, Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law, Boaz, but that at a secondary level, the book is about David. And the blessing of David. Now, look at this. Notice how I've structured the independent and dependent clauses. What is the independent clause in the first sentence? Okay, so I have a prepositional clause here, a dependent clause here at the beginning. But the independent clause is God blesses. So the way I am structuring this is significant. I'm making God the central character here, and God's action of blessing. I'm characterizing the action that God does in the story as blessing. And notice that he's blessing Naomi. So Naomi is the central character in my characterization, and Ruth is a means for God blessing Naomi. There's lots of interpretive choice going on here in how I have chosen to do this. And I lay out the ways God blesses: food, land, and family. All right? So this is a very succinct, but also there's a complexity to this thesis statement or synthesis statement. You see, I'm conveying a lot of information in a compact form. So this is part of the exercise, is trying to do this. And it's not as if there's one right sentence, but the exercise is trying to sum up and trying to do it as succinctly and as carefully as possible. That's the exercise that we're engaged in, and that has a lot of benefit to doing it. So that's my claim. A thesis is a claim to my reader, to my audience. And then I have to substantiate it. I have to tell you why this is in fact the case. I have to provide the evidence from the book. So what I can do then is break this thesis down into 4 different claims. Each of those pieces needs to be substantiated. Okay? Now, I'm working actually in reverse of the way I would study this out and come to this conclusion, right? I would actually come from the other side in my study of looking at all the evidence in the book, looking at all the pieces, and seeing different themes and different important elements. And then I put them all together into the thesis. But in the presentation of your paper, you work in the opposite direction. You give me the claim, and then you show me the sub-claims and then the evidence of those claims as you work them out. So I break this down into 4 claims. Naomi is utterly destitute because she has lost food, land, and family. I can't assume that these are any foregone conclusions here, okay? Because I'm picturing someone who's critical, someone who's skeptical, and reading what I'm writing carefully and with questions. So even this, I can't just assume it. I have to show that Naomi is destitute and she's lost food, land, and family. That's the problem of the book. The first, or presenting problem. Then Ruth is loyal to her mother-in-law Naomi, and her faithfulness is unlikely. So I have to show that that's the case. Number 2. Number 3, God is the one who uses Ruth to bless Naomi with food, land, and family. All right? It's not just that Ruth does this, but that God is involved here as a character in the story and working through Ruth. And finally, I have to show that the book is ultimately concerned with the birth of King David. It's not just about these characters, it's additionally, secondarily, about what God is doing in King David. So I can move on from claims to themes. I'm saying that these themes run through the book. That God uses unlikely people, including the poor and the socially marginalized. You see, I've moved to another level of abstraction here from the book. That, number 2, God works through tenacious human loyalty. Number 3, that God is a redeemer who blesses despite profound human loss. And number 4, that God provides a king for his people, David, who will ultimately lead to Jesus Christ. So these would be themes that I might preach on if I were preaching from the book of Ruth. But for right now, they are moving to more general expression from those claims that I laid out. So first we need to look at Naomi's loss. What's the evidence for Naomi's loss? Well, first of all, there's a famine in the land. Okay, so the loss of food and sustenance. Then they have to leave the land of promise, the land of Canaan, where they have come because God is giving it to Israel. They have to leave that land and they travel to Moab, to a foreign land. So they're losing land after they've lost food. And then what happens in Moab? Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, dies. Okay, so loss of family. So already we see the loss that I have expressed, that I put forward as the types of loss that we find in the book. But it's not only Elimelech, it's also the sons Machlon and Kilion. They die. But that's not it. Her daughter-in-law, Orpah, also leaves her and departs. So she's lost everybody. And she actually urges Ruth to leave her, but Ruth refuses to. She's left destitute, without father, because she left her family with her husband, without a husband and without sons. That's the state of Naomi at the beginning of the book. So it's a state of loss. So we have evidence for this claim. And then we have it thematized in what she says to the women of Bethlehem when they finally return there. She says, "Call me no longer Naomi," which in Hebrew means sweet or pleasant. Don't call me sweet thing. Don't call me sweetie anymore. Call me Mara, bitter. Okay, so this is how she's describing her loss and what it's done to her. "For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." It's God's fault. God is the one who's behind it. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Okay, another one of these binaries or contrasts, from sweet to bitter, from full to empty. "Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me? The Almighty has brought calamity upon me." So her speech to the women of Bethlehem is saying God is the agent behind my loss. It's putting the spotlight on God's character and God's activity. And it's saying God is the cause of the problem. Now the narrator hasn't told us this, but this is how Naomi views it. And it raises the question, is this true? Did God really do this? And is this really the whole story about who God is? Or is God more than this? Or other than this? Okay, so Naomi has suffered great loss. She's the central character at the beginning of the book. Not Ruth, but Naomi. And she also faces challenges. So remember, I talked about the challenges that are faced by not only Naomi, but also by Ruth. Ruth would be much better off in Moab. She would have protection and support by returning to her father's house. The normal social safety net, social structure, remember, in the patriarchal father's house. She should return back to that family, since this family is now devastated with the loss of the men. It would be easier for her to find another husband in Moab, because that's her country, and her future stability is dependent upon that, dependent upon the men in that culture, in that set of social relations. And in fact, the Israelites despised the Moabites and were not supposed to marry them. So it's a very bleak prospect for her to leave Moab and to go to Judah in Israel. Okay, so some of the challenges that are faced. And Naomi actually says to both daughters-in-law, to Ruth and Orpah, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband. So go back and find a husband. You'll be much better off. Naomi's trying to stop them from helping her, stop them from accompanying her, because they know for their sake, she knows for their sake, they'd be better off to stay and not to go with her. Basically, to die as a widow with no means. She continues. She has to keep saying this to them. Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Okay, so the point is, you need a husband. You need men to take care of you and to support you. And there's no hope of that if you go with me. After Orpah leaves, she says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. See, repeatedly saying, this is not a good choice for your future. So, the practice of levirate marriage is being referred to here. It's actually not able to be practiced here because there are no brothers left. They all died. But this is where she's saying, do I have sons in my womb? If there were other brothers, they could marry you, but I don't have any children left. I don't have any sons left. So we can't actually carry out levirate marriage, which was the practice of brothers marrying the wife of a deceased brother to raise up the family and continue it. So I'm looking at some background here, some other biblical texts that support my thesis, but also support what the book is doing. So this is another piece of evidence that I can look at. The view of the Moabite. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. All right, so strong prohibition against intermarrying with the Moabites. This is another challenge of the attitude of the Israelites to the Moabites and why it's not a good choice to go back to the land with Naomi. But despite all the odds, despite all these challenges, Ruth is characterized as miraculously, supernaturally loyal to Naomi. She risks her future by traveling to a foreign land to care for her destitute mother-in-law. She risks her safety by gleaning from the fields during the barley and wheat harvests. So as a foreigner and as a single woman to go out and work among the men in the fields, that's not a safe thing for her to be doing. She risks her reputation by going to the threshing floor at night to ask for Boaz's redemption. She goes out with the men on the threshing floor in the middle of the night when they've been drinking. Not a safe thing for her to be doing, but she's risking her safety for the sake of the family and for the sake of caring for, protecting, providing for her mother-in-law, Naomi. And so, as we've seen before, the characterization of these characters is often expressed through what they say to each other. The narrator in Ruth does more of this through the speech of the characters than by explicitly making his own comments as a narrator. He's letting us follow the characterization based upon what they're saying. So, another piece of evidence, what the characters are saying. She says to Naomi, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where I go, you will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. So she's saying, I will give up everything for you. I'll give up my people. I will give up my gods. I will choose your people and your gods, or your God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. That's actually not hyperbolic at this point. That's the prospect that they have in going back and going together, the two widows. They could very well perish. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well. That's a vow expression. She's articulating a vow that if anything but death parts them, these bad things should happen to her. God can carry out this judgment upon her. So it's even stronger than just choosing to do this. She takes a vow that requires her to do it, or else she'll receive a punishment from God's hand. Amazing loyalty on the part of Ruth against all odds. Another background text for gleaning here in Deuteronomy: when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall go back you shall not go back and get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. This seems to be a background to the book of Ruth, the theme of blessing that we're going to see in the book, but also the theme of caring for what? Aliens and widows. That's exactly what we have with Naomi, a widow, and Ruth, a widow who is an alien. This text in Deuteronomy is showing God's care for those people and God's desire to care for them and also to bless Israel as they care for them. That's what we see in the book of Ruth when Ruth goes to glean to provide food for them because they have no food, so they can survive. There's another background practice, the practice of goel, or the redeemer. And for the students at Hebrew, we've seen the verb ga'al, to redeem. Goel is the participial form of that verb, redeemer, but it's a social institution in Israel. That's a background to the book. Naomi's situation involves redemption, not levirate marriage. It's raised by her, but it's not possible because she has no other sons. And there's no brother-in-law to marry Ruth. But the practice of the Redeemer has some overlap with the levirate, but it's different and broader. The Redeemer, the Goel, is the nearest male family member, and that person has a responsibility to recover the losses of the tribe in various contexts. It could be through death, it could be through legal issues, or it could be economic loss. The Goel is to watch out for the family and to protect family members in these different situations. And so this is actually the category that the book is operating with. And Boaz is one of the redeemers, but he's not the closest redeemer in the family line, family relationship. So that's another background. God's activity. As we've said, God isn't often explicitly referred to in the book in the narrative or in the narrator's comments, but he is referred to often by the characters in the book. And there's one narrator comment at the beginning, and actually one explicit one at the end. So they form a frame around the book in chapter 1 and chapter 4. The two explicit references to God and God's activity, and the others are indirect references through the characters. The first one, the Lord had considered his people and given them bread. It's the Hebrew verb natan. God is portrayed as a giver. He's giving, which is in contrast to Naomi's characterization of God as one who takes, right? He took away everything. The narrator says God natan, God gives bread to his people in the land of Bethlehem, which is, as we saw in Hebrew class, Beit Lechem, house of bread, which was ironically a place of famine, but now has become a place of God's provision, God's natan. We also have in the book these references to chance, but it's to be read as not random occurrence, but when these coincidences happen or chances happen, it's behind that is the assumption of God's providence, that God is in control of things, and so that these things are working out miraculously for his purposes. So we have a couple of examples here in the middle on the slide. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. That's Ruth, who was of the family of Elimelech. That's meant to be significant. It wasn't just anybody. She had no idea who it was, but she came actually to a family member, in a very generous man in the family. By chance, apparently. It just so happened, but it didn't happen by chance, according to the perspective of the book. It was meant to be by God. And another example of this, no sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there, than, look, who's this? The closest Redeemer just happens to pass by. So that's not by chance. It just so happens right when he got there, right when he was ready to work for the redemption of Naomi and Ruth, the man he needed to see passed by, and they were able to negotiate. And then finally, the last reference in the book to the explicit activity of God by the narrator, on the bottom of the slide here, when they, Boaz and Ruth, came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Now, in this translation, it's not clear, but there's a strange expression of this in Hebrew. It's not the typical expression, but it says God gave her conception. God gave her conception, and that's the same Hebrew verb, natan. Remember that we saw in the first narrator comment, he gave bread, he gave food. Now he gives conception. So these two references frame the book, and they depict God as a giver, the giving God, who's giving. What is he giving? He's giving food, and he's giving family, children, to this family that had none. We're talking about God's activity in the book and how I've portrayed it in my message statement. The characters in the book seem to be constantly blessing each other and invoking God in the blessing. So this is how God is shown to be a blessing God. Naomi in Moab says to Ruth, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." So it's a blessing upon them. Boaz says to Ruth in the field, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." It's a blessing. So we're seeing God portrayed as the one who blesses. So these are other people blessing Ruth. Okay? Boaz blesses on the threshing floor. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." What's he talking about here? He's saying, I'm much older than you are, and you had better prospects. There were other fish in the sea. You could have gone after younger men, more attractive men, but you came to me because I'm in your family, because you thought that I was the nearest Redeemer. So it's your loyalty to the family and to Naomi that's driving you, not your self-seeking desire. So may God bless you. May God be pleased with that and bless you. The peoples and elders at the gate also bless. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, two matriarchs. And what was the problem? They were barren and unable to bear children, but God miraculously gave them children. And Ruth is being compared to them seen on analogy to them. And this is, in fact, what God's going to do to her. She's, for all practical purposes, barren. She doesn't have any means of having children, but God is going to provide a way for the family line to continue and for her to have children. They built together the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. There's a Judah reference, and by the end of the book we'll see how important the line of Judah is for the book. But another unlikely matriarch, Tamar, remember, she lost her husband, and then her father-in-law, Judah, refused to give his another son to her, and so he wasn't practicing the levirate marriage, and she was without children. But through her scheme, God gave her children by her father-in-law. So another woman who was without children but was enabled to have children through unusual and remarkable circumstances. These are the ways of characterizing Ruth as a matriarch in Israel's history, though she's a Moabite. So the book ends with David's line. Okay? Let's pull that out. David's line. There's a genealogy at the end of the book. And I'm marshaling this as evidence for the book being about, not just about these characters, but using these characters as a way of also speaking about larger realities of Israel's history and life in the Davidic monarchy. And what we see is that Boaz is in the line of Judah, and in the genealogy at the book, he's the one who married Ruth, the Moabite, and had Obed, was their child, the one that God gave to them, who was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. Now, it's always worthwhile asking of biblical genealogies how they've been structured, because biblical genealogies are different than the kinds of genealogies we're used to. They're very artistic, and they're selective. So the composer of the genealogy will select names. It's why it's very difficult to date things with genealogies. They'll select different names and put them into patterns, patterns of 7, or different kinds of structures. And here we have a selective genealogy that is in the pattern of 10 names. And David is the 10th. Well, why is this? We also have Boaz being the 7th and the 10th as highlighted positions. Why is this? Why would the author of the genealogy do this? It seems to be referring to the book of Genesis, where we have a lot of genealogies, and we have Noah being the 10th from Adam in Genesis 5, and Abraham being the 10th from Shem, depending on how you view chapter 11. So the 10th position in the genealogy is a special position of highlight. Also, we recognize that Noah and Abraham both received covenants from God. So it could be this 10th position of David is the one of the person who receives a covenant, according to this pattern found in Genesis, which David does receive. He receives the Davidic covenant, the covenant of monarchy, that his descendant will continue on the throne forever. So it's not just that through Ruth's loyalty, Naomi's life is saved, but God has a larger purpose through this unlikely Moabite widow, because it's through her union with Boaz that this line in Judah is continued that will result in the ultimate king in Israel, David, and the covenant given by God to David. coming to a conclusion here, I also want to point out the significance of the end of the book of Judges and the references in the book of Ruth. Okay? How does the book of Judges end? The book of Judges says, in those days there was no king. That's a bad thing, but it holds out the promise of a king in the future as a good thing, as a desirable thing, as a hope. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So we have in the book of Ruth a woman who doesn't do what's right in her own eyes. She gives up her life. She sacrifices her life out of loyalty to another, out of loyalty to Naomi and her family. And through that sacrifice and that suffering and that loyalty, we receive a king in Israel through this line. And so the book of Ruth begins with connecting it to the book of Judges in the days when the judges ruled. So it's referring to that period and perhaps even to that book of Judges, saying this is the backdrop, a very negative, very hopeless in many ways backdrop to the book. But this is a story of God's redemption and God's blessing and the hope that God creates in the king of Israel. Because this book ends with this genealogy that Obed, the son of Boaz and Ruth, becomes the father of Jesse and then the father of David. So the king, well, what the author sees as the hope or the solution to the problem of Judges is coming through this family. So this is how I like to think of the relationship of the book of Ruth to the book of Judges, because we've seen these references in the book that connect it up with Judges. It seems to be intentionally related to the book of Judges. And you could think about the relationship as one of the relationship between the black velvet and a small diamond, right? The black velvet is the backdrop to view a diamond and to see it shine. If you go to a jeweler to look at different diamonds, they'll put it on black velvet. The book of Judges is much longer and much darker, of course, and it's this broader backdrop of evil and destruction and apostasy that we have with very little hope, except for a few clues of hope in Judah and hope in a king. And then the book of Ruth is this small encapsulation of God's activity and faithfulness to provide the king, like the diamond that shines. And it shines all the brighter against the backdrop of the book of Judges, which is this black velvet. So we really need to read Judges and Ruth together. And I think that's what those canonical references at the beginning and end of Ruth are about, is signals for us to read these two books together, that you need to understand the evil and the corruption of the book of Judges, but you also need to understand the hopefulness in small ways that God is bringing about David and the monarchy as a hope for the future. That's what I have for today. I hope this gives you a good introduction to the book of Ruth, but also an illustration of how I would carry out the assignment with the project of synthesizing the book's message and then breaking it down into the different claims and then showing evidence from the book of those different claims. That's how you should do your paper. And if you follow those examples, I think you'll do very well. If you have any questions, please be in touch by email. I'm happy to help with things. And We're going to continue to do class online for the next week, and possibly after that if we need to as an institution. But let's keep delving into the Old Testament and learning despite the circumstances. Thank you for tuning in to the stream today and participating, and we'll look forward to the next interaction we have. Thank you.